what is the difference between an intellectual virtue and a moral virtue? When we talk about the intellectual virtues, what are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a controversial question among the philosophers. But I would say there are some of the intellectual virtues have very clearly intellectual names, like open-mindedness. That seems like a virtue that's clearly intellectual and pretty clearly not merely moral virtue. Although there will be moral elements involved in open-mindedness, a kind of willingness to be maybe a kind of humility that would be necessary for the really open-minded person. Let's see now. Where did I? The difference between yes. So there are some of the virtues are clearly named in a way that makes them sound very intellectual. Other virtues, other intellectual virtues, are named by the names of moral virtues. So, for example, I was speaking a moment ago about our interaction with one another in intellectual matters, and there a kind of generosity is important. One of the ways that we learn from others is to learn to admire their accomplishments, and that's a kind of generosity of spirit. Similarly, humility is a virtue that's both both moral and intellectual. And so the question might arise: well, what makes intellectual generosity intellectual, and what makes intellectual humility intellectual? And I think that the answer to that is just a matter of context. So if the context is an intellectual context in which intellectual goods are at issue or are being promoted, then the virtue becomes an intellectual virtue. Perhaps you could say that it becomes intellectual in virtue of the community caring about intellectual goods. So there's a kind of a basic intellectual virtue of loving understanding and truth and knowledge that's behind all of the other intellectual virtues like generosity or humility.
So it turns out that Schopenhauer is wrong on another count, because moral virtues and intellectual virtues are going to turn out to be actually the same kinds of virtues, just in two different contexts.
In large part.
Okay.
I think so.
I agree in large part, and one of the virtues that you didn't mention that complicates this just a little bit at least is something like curiosity or inquisitiveness. On the one hand, that seems really fundamental to the search for knowledge and understanding. It provides that basic motivation.
Yeah.
But you'd rarely see curiosity on any list of moral virtues. Indeed, depending on how you understand it, it could be considered even a moral vice.
Right, curiositas is
yes, exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly how it's treated by Augustine and others.
Yeah.
So that's right. I tend to think that there's a lot of overlap, and but then that there are some sort of outlying cases on both the moral side and the intellectual side that allow for some kind of a distinction, and I think as well a very kind of simple way to draw a distinction there, and it's a superficial distinction, is to think in terms of what are the personal qualities that you need in order to be a good thinker or a good learner, right? And there, what comes to mind are things like curiosity and open-mindedness and intellectual humility and intellectual carefulness and thoroughness and attentiveness, right? And then if you think alternatively, what are the qualities that I need in order to be a good neighbor, right? And there you might think more in terms of kindness and compassion and respect and generosity. Now, I completely agree that there are versions of those traits that also apply to the life of the mind, and that's why you can't draw too sharp of a distinction. But if you think of intellectual virtues as the character traits of a good thinker or a good inquirer, a good learner, moral virtues as the character traits of a good neighbor, maybe civic virtues as the character traits of a good citizen. I think that allows for a helpful first pass way of making some distinctions.
But if you look at the reasons that the classic Christian thinkers had for rejecting curiosity as a virtue, you see that they are actually kind of moral criteria. So, for example, Augustine thought of curiosity as just a kind of indiscriminate desire for sensory stimulation and sensational knowledge, maybe gossip and kinds of knowledge that we think are actually degrade us or are at best are unimportant, trivial or something. And so one of the virtues that an intellectually competent person needs is an ability to discriminate the important matters to know and understand from the unimportant or even corrupting matters.
And I'd say that's necessary. That kind of further elaboration and characterization is necessary even for thinking of it as a genuine virtue. So unbridled curiosity or curiosity about subject matters that are either just completely trivial or maybe morally problematic, I'd say that's not a genuine intellectual virtue, that intellectual virtues are motivated by a desire to know and understand important truths, however you want to understand that, right? Not the trivial or otherwise problematic truths. So all of that to say, curiosity as criticized by Augustine and others from a moral standpoint wouldn't, in my view, count even as an intellectual virtue. It would need to be retooled in ways for it to count as a genuine intellectual excellence.
Yes, but the point to see about that is that it's the moral quality of proper love of truth and love of understanding that makes it into a virtue.
Partially moral, right? So I agree that moral considerations constrain what counts as worthy subject matters. But I think it's an interesting question whether there are sort of intrinsically intellectually interesting or fascinating subjects or issues or questions.
Yes.
It's also interesting to think about the way that being a moral person is going to impact sort of the way you go about any kind of intellectual search. I'm thinking about Pascal, and one thing that he says is that the way that you search is going to be deeply dependent on how moral you are as a person. So if we were rivals and you had just published a great paper, I would, if I were the wrong kind of person, I would be motivated intellectually to find reasons why your great discovery was false, right? Because it actually turns out that being intellectually generous is going to require me not to be envious. My intellectual virtues are going to get hampered by a lack of moral virtue in that moment.
That's helpful. And it's funny, even in the conversation so far, I think we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit between a very broad conception of moral and a narrow conception. So if moral is just like being a good person or living a good life, then I think intellectual virtues just are moral virtues.
Right, yeah.
Because I think that part of what it is to be a good person is to love things and pursue things that are good. And I think knowledge and understanding are goods. And so part of what it is to be a good person is to love those things and to wonder about them and to pursue them in ways that are open-minded and tenacious but humble and attentive and so forth.
And there's always going to be this sense that being virtuous it requires balance between all of the virtues, right? Like the virtues can't just exist. Oh, I'm an extremely rational person and I have that virtue, but I lack self-discipline. You can't do that. It turns out they have to be united.
Yes, if you ask why we even have a separate category for intellectual virtues, it seems that the answer is intellectual matters, understanding and knowing and pursuing truth are extremely important in human life. They're an absolutely crucial aspect of human flourishing. And And so they warrant, you might say, special treatment.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, maybe if somebody tried to come up with a bunch of football virtues, we'd probably laugh, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
the intellectual virtues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.